Well, my name is Collier Royce Watson. I was born March the 3rd, 1948. I am the ninth of nine children born to Jim and Era Watson. I think that the house was built actually over a span of probably the years 1938 and 1939. It took more than 1 year, so to speak, because of the way that it was built. That there was one master carpenter who worked full time, and then there were farmhands who were either working in the fields or helping Dad milk cows. And when they finished with the milking, then they would come and help the carpenter build the house. So it took a considerable amount of time, according to what I was told, for the house to be built. Well, of course, the major material with this being a rock house, and thing I think is really neat, is the rock came off the farm. So the rock was picked up by the farm, off of the farm, and brought in and placed on the walls. And one of the interesting things about the house is that all of the trim around the doors, the archways, the windows, all of the trim is limestone. And so all of the limestone was quarried on the farm and chipped, so to speak, to fit into place. And I assume took quite a bit of physical labor to get every stone to fit the way that they wanted it to fit. So it was very much a handmade custom house. The stories that I was told is that the lumber for the house, it was actually lumber that was taken out of prior dwellings. I'd heard that when the school was consolidated and a one-room schoolhouse was abandoned, well, my dad would buy the schoolhouse and tear down the lumber and save it until this house was built. And I know when we started remodeling the house, it was kind of interesting when we got all the walls back down to the solid wood, that there was lumber that it was not uniform at all. It runs in all different directions going through the walls. Some of the old lumber would have paint on it, some of it wouldn't. But so in 1938, probably the wood was many decades old before this house was even built. So and there's not a wall in this house that you could put a sledgehammer through. Every wall is solid wood. There's no such thing as a stud in the house. The other house I know nothing about, but this house is so solid, it's really unbelievable. One of the stories that I remember David was telling is that when they laid the foundation for this house, and it's on a pier and beam, but roughly 4 feet down is absolute solid rock. And so when they laid out the perimeter of the house and dug it, that was all dug by hand, and they went down to solid rock. And from there, they came up with the foundation. So, as we're speaking, the house is like 70 years old, and the floors are absolutely solid. There's no give to the house. It's, as they say, it's solid as a rock. Well, this was the only house that I ever lived in. And so I stayed here until I graduated from high school and went to college. So, of course, the years that I was in high school, I graduated in 1966. So, lived in the era of the 60s. And I guess I'm a great Beatles fan. That was the big music at the time. And, I guess it's always a neat time to be alive. But the 60s were a good time to grow up and be a teenager. Yeah, Coleman changed in that I can remember as a child, say like 8, 9, 10 years old, that going to town on Saturday was a big deal. And you could go to town on Saturday and have a hard time to find a place to park. There were at one time, I guess it was actually probably back in the 40s, I think Coleman County had about 40,000 people in it. And today, the county has less than 10,000 people in it, of which roughly about 6 of those live in the city of Coleman. So used to, Saturday was a big time in downtown Coleman, and we would go to the theater. That you could take 25 cents and go to the theater and see a movie, and it was great fun. You always look forward to Saturday. probably by the time I was a teenager, the community had begun to decline to where the Saturdays were no longer that big of a deal, and so I don't think it was as much fun as probably the kids that grew up in the 50s, but still, we had fun. Well, the room that we are currently in was quote my room, and as I remember as a child, that the oldest child that was here was Ruth, and so Ruth, Carolyn, and Marguerite and I were all here at the same time. Everyone else had already left the family, so to speak. So, and Ruth wasn't here all that long before she got married. So it was mainly Carolyn and Marguerite and I. I don't know if I've had older sisters or just several mothers. Seems like, women are kind of all that I've ever known. So I've had lots of supervision. Well, the dairy was still at this location when I was a young child. And even through like grade school, I can remember that we would get off the school bus and walk from the cattle guard to the house. And then Marguerite and I would go to the barn, and our job was to put out feed for the next morning for the cows. And so we had what was called stanchion stalls where all the cows were brought in to milk, and we would put feed into the feed trough and move it down in front of each stanchion so that the cows would have feed for the next morning. And I don't remember exactly how old I was when we moved to the dairy, but we owned a place across north of Highway 67, and Dad built at that time a, quote, modern dairy barn, which meant that we had a pipeline, that the milk went directly from the cow straight into the refrigerated tank without being handled, so to speak, by human hands. And when that dairy was built, my dad hired a hired hand who lived on the other side of the highway, who basically ran the dairy. So I guess when my dad was around the age of, I'm going to guess around 65, he kind of backed off of the day-to-day actual milking of the cows. I don't know really when he started dairying, but he was basically milking cows all of his life. Well, I think that this is a place that housed a family. And what's special about this place is not the house, it's the family that grew up here, and the family that continues, and the feelings that somehow permeate through this family of being a unit. And no matter how many exponential Marians there are or whatever, everyone becomes part of the family, and they're readily accepted and loved. And we just have a unique relationship in this family that I think is quite strange for a family history. And the more generations that can hold, the better off mankind is. Well, there are actually two Watson family reunions that are defined by our family. One is the one that I grew up with, was a family reunion held in Lampasas. That there was a city park in Lampasas and a pool there, and we always looked forward to going there. And that family reunion was again the Watsons, but it incorporated a much bigger span of the Watson clan. And I don't remember the exact year, but it was probably sometime in the 70s that we kind of broke away, that our family had become so big that we could actually hold our own family reunion. And we started just holding it with the descendants of Jim and Era Watson and going from there. And so I think we've been going, as we speak now, probably a minimum of 30 to 35 years with this family having the reunion each year. Well, after our mom left here and went to move and live in town, The house kind of went into a state of vacancy and basically disrepair. For several years, we actually rented the house out to hunters who came and they just lived in it when they were here hunting. But around, I think the year was 1999 that Ann and I decided that we were going to remodel the house. There was a point when David and I bought our sisters out, and we picked the land that we were going to buy, and I ended up with the land that had the house on it. And so that was somewhat of a predicament because you can't just walk by and watch it fall apart. So we decided that we were going to restore it. So I believe the year was around 1999 when we finished our restoration. And the restoration was kind of strange and was almost similar to the way that my father built it, in that we had two men come in and work on this house, and it took them about 18 months. And just two men completely remodeled it. Now, when I say remodeled, we tried to keep the theme of the house to being a farmhouse. And we wanted to leave as much original as we could and yet modernize it with the things like air conditioning and central heat and air. And like I said, it just took them a long time, but we restored a lot of the stuff that went back original. Even things went back original to the time it was built. During the years, such modern things had occurred as linoleum, and there was a lot of the house that had linoleum on the pine floors, and we had all that linoleum stripped off, and that was quite a chore. The guys that reworked this guaranteed me that whatever they put that linoleum down with would have been illegal today because it stuck. And so they took all that up and came back and redid the floors. One of the things that I find is kind of unique is that the framing, the door framing, the baseboards, all like that, haven't been touched. That's exactly the way they were in 1939. And it's just what we call a varnish finish to them. And it's held up quite well. So the major changes, I guess, that we did is the house had wallpaper all through it, and it's what we call cheesecloth wallpaper. And so we took all of that down and put we put sheetrock up on all the walls and painted the sheetrock and kind of went from there. One of the interesting things in the remodeling with the sheetrock was the what we call the famous rounded corners. We have two closets in the house that have the rounded corners, and sheetrocking a round wall is kind of interesting as to how that's done. And I have fun having people guess how we put sheetrock up on the rounded corners, and no one ever guesses the way that it was done. That we actually did it with a 55-gallon drum. We would wet down the sheetrock and use a rope and tie the sheetrock down to the drum and bend it a little each day until we could get it to form fit the wall. And so we have a rounded sheetrock wall. Well, there's no doubt I would like to see it continue as long as possible. Again, the particular chemistry that this family has, I think, is very unique. I have a hard time, well, I don't have a hard time explaining it. I can't explain it. It just exists. And so, we love having the people come to the farmhouse. It's kind of a central point that focuses everyone back upon the origin, so to speak. And I would love for people to continue enjoying it for as long as time goes on. Well, this was before hot water heaters implemented pressure relief valves. And so it was very cold. All the water was frozen. So when the hot water heater was on, and it was a gas hot water heater, So it was still getting fuel and it kept boiling, but there was no place for the pressure to go. And so it just kept building up pressure and pressure until it finally exploded, and it actually lifted off like a rocket. And you can see some of the pictures. You'll see the hole in the roof where it launched from the bathroom floor and went through the ceiling and landed several hundred yards out in the field behind the house. Yeah, that was quite an experience. I was actually here when that happened, although I honestly do not have firsthand recognition or recall of what happened. But Carolyn was home from school sick, and we were in the back bedroom. It was very, very cold, and so we had the house all shut up. And Marguerite and I were playing on the floor. And my mom, as I remember, was in the corner of the house, maybe sewing. And so, again, Marguerite and I were playing with toy cars by the door that would go out into the hallway by the bathroom. And I think that Carolyn had called us over or something, but, Marguerite and I had gotten up off the floor and gone over to the bed. And we were over at the bed when the explosion occurred. And so the blast that went down the hallway and blew the door inside where we had been playing, so that all the cars where we had been were crushed. And the four of us that were in the back bedroom were all away from the blast area. And so, again, I think I was maybe 4, perhaps 5 years old when it happened. So I really don't remember the actual event other than what people have told me about where we were and what happened. So I don't remember getting out of the house or what all happened afterwards. But I do remember the pictures, and it made quite a mess.